Hi, this is David Bennett with the North Carolina Maritime Museum System, and today we're continuing our multi-part series on the North Carolina Fisheries Incorporated and the Great Depression. Today we're covering Part 6, The End, 1939, and this is about the final year of operations for the North Carolina Fisheries Incorporated and is the last part to our series. Last time we talked about how Stanley Woodland took over as new manager of the North Carolina Fisheries Incorporated in November of 1938, and it was hoped that he was going to bring a breath of fresh air and revitalize the fisheries and hopefully make it profitable. One of the first things that Stanley Woodland did was try to repair the relationship between the North Carolina Fisheries Incorporated and local fish dealers. They were estranged from one another because the fish dealers saw the fisheries as a government-funded business that was competing unfairly and also competing for the loyalty of fishermen. So what Stanley Woodland did was on every Friday, he and the fish dealers in Morehead City would get together and they would air grievances, they'd talk things out, they'd come up with solutions and get on the same page. They also tried to set prices, a range of prices for different seafood products so they wouldn't try and outcompete each other. And Stanley Woodland also promised to operate the fisheries as a co-op that was focused on frozen seafood. He also tried to repair the relationship with fishermen and bring them back into the fold and get them back into fishing for the fisheries. In 1939, North Carolina was going to change its net regulations. They're going from 2¼ inch stretched mesh to 2½ inches stretched mesh. And it was feared that the fishermen weren't going to be able to afford new nets. And their old nets were going to be of no use to them. And it was also feared that the dealers weren't going to be able to finance enough nets. And so Stanley Woodland and the fisheries said that they were going to try and help out the fishermen as much as they possibly could with loans for new nets. So this caused Stanley to examine the fisheries fisherman loan program, and he realized that there's some major problems with it. He said any fisherman that's doing any business at all will wear out at least 4 stands of sink nets before he could pay for 1 stand of net. So you're going to use multiple nets before you're ever going to be able to pay for the 1 net. And he said that's unacceptable. No wonder fishermen aren't wanting to do business with us. No wonder they're not wanting to pay back their loans. They can't afford them. He said this is ridiculous and it's something that needs to change. And to their credit, they tried to change the structure of the program to make it more affordable. Unfortunately, the fisheries was also facing overwhelming odds in 1939. There was an overproduction of shrimp, so not everyone was able to get rid of their shrimp, and shrimp was going at lower prices. They weren't able to get enough fish for filleting. There's increased competition from Virginia and Maryland that was driving down the prices of fish. And there's just a lack of frozen inventory because they had to throw away a lot of their fish from the previous year because of contamination problems. Then a Mr. Webb, who's from Swansboro, who was also a member of the fisheries, suggested canning clams. He said, the fisheries has a lot of canning equipment. Why don't we use that to can and market clams? And Stanley Woodland said, that's a good idea, but why don't we try and sell frozen clams and frozen clam juice? So what was the big deal with clams? Well, during the Great Depression, clams were on the rise in North Carolina, particularly Carteret County. Carteret County during the 1930s was producing over 90% of the clams sold in North Carolina. A big reason for this was because the hurricane of September 1933 came through Carteret County and opened up a lot of inlets in Core Sound, which allowed more salt water to get into Core Sound, increasing the salinity of the water, which allowed the clams to grow larger and more numerous. And so people in the Core Sound area were clamming more because what was going on was the women and children could go out clamming while the men were out fishing. The men might not make a whole lot of money fishing, but they could supplement their income with the clams. And the clams were what's putting clothing on children and putting bread on tables in many instances. And so you saw this fishery just grow significantly during the Depression years. So Stanley Woodland went out and started talking to different companies that were making clam chowder. And he came upon the Campbell Soup Company, and they were making uh, clam chowder 10 months out of the years, and they needed thousands and thousands of pounds of clams. And one of the advantages that North Carolina had was at that time, Carteret County was producing a lot of clams. And plus, it could uh, produce clams almost year round. Whereas up north, there was a limit on the clamming seasons because during the cold months, you'd get a lot of snow and frost and frozen water, and it just wasn't. You just couldn't clam year round up north, and so this seemed to be a real opportunity for the North Carolina Fisheries Incorporated, an opportunity to make money, but also an opportunity to really help um, funnel business towards a lot of these fishing communities, uh, particularly to the communities that were suffering financially uh, in the Core Sound area. Unfortunately, this deal doesn't come through fast enough, and on August 26, 1939, they're nearly out of money, and so they decide to temporarily close the fisheries until they can land this big deal with the Campbell Soup Company. And the Self Help Corporation is really behind this decision. They're the parent company to the North Carolina Fisheries Incorporated, and they basically make this decision because they've run out of money to advance to the fisheries. They've run out of this big initial loan that they had from the federal government. Then on December 8th, 1939, they're really out of time. They couldn't get any more funding from the federal government. This deal with Campbell doesn't materialize, and they've nearly hit their 6 months of inoperation, which would have caused the plant and the land that it was on to revert back uh, to the county because the county had provided the land and a lot of funding um, for the facility. And so they started to go through the steps to dissolve the North Carolina Fisheries Incorporated. They repay the members their membership fees, they transfer assets to Self Help Corporation, and then they dissolve the North Carolina Fisheries Incorporated. And by dissolving it, there's the potential to bring it back and to reorganize it as a new fishing cooperative because the Self Help Corporation was going to hang on to those assets. Unfortunately, this never happens, and the fisheries goes away forever. So was it worth it? I think there's two schools of thought on this. There's the school of thought that says the fisheries needed to be profitable in order to be sustainable because ultimately it wasn't profitable and that's why it went away. Also, people joined co-ops in order to share in the net profits, which, because it never produced a profit, the fishermen were never able uh, to benefit from those net profits. Then, on the other hand, you have to consider that it was the Great Depression. The fishermen and their families were suffering financially. People were losing property. Um, People couldn't operate their businesses effectively. They needed assistance. Um, they're having trouble putting clothing on their children and bread and meat on the table. And here you had the fisheries, which was helping fishermen get loans. It was providing them an outlet where they could sell their seafood products. And at times when the dealers weren't able to buy, so it was a real benefit to the community. Something to keep in mind and take note of is that most co-ops that came about during the Great Depression failed, and many of them that were successful went away when they were no longer needed. So when the economy was recovering, these co-ops began to go away because people didn't feel like they needed them anymore. And in the late 1930s, the commercial fishing industry in North Carolina was moving towards recovery. Um, and things were improving in terms of the price of fish. And so perhaps the fisheries wasn't needed as it would have been earlier in the Depression. After all, the idea for the North Carolina Fisheries Incorporated came about in early 1934 when the seafood industry in North Carolina was at a real low. And the North Carolina Fisheries Incorporated faced all sorts of obstacles to success. These are just some of my top ones. There's a lack of cooperative spirit, and there's also this perceived. It was also perceived that the fisheries was a welfare program. Those two things together seem to indicate to me the fisheries did not do a very good job at educating the fishermen and their families about what it was about. It wasn't a welfare program. It was a program. It was a private nonprofit designed to get people off the public welfare. It was designed to make people independent again, self-reliant. Um, they also didn't do a very good job of managing periods of overabundance to scarcity. They never found this happy medium, and they never really were able to utilize their freezing capability and their cold storage capability to its full potential. Uh, there was strong competition from the Chesapeake Bay and northern markets that drove down prices. Trawlers were glutting the market. There's a lack of demand for seafood within North Carolina's interior. People just weren't eating a whole lot of seafood in North Carolina, and what seafood was being consumed was coming from out of state because it was cheaper to source it from out of state. Um, Frozen fish was a new concept, as well as the whole idea of frozen foods. It wasn't widespread in the United States at this time. It wasn't going to be until after World War II that frozen foods became popular. So you're talking about opening up entering a real niche market in a time of economic depression, which would have been a real struggle. Then the costs of production were far too high. Um, Processing and freezing um, seafood and then transporting it, they had a hard time keeping their costs low. And you have to remember that this co-op was experimental. Uh, there were very few fishing co-ops on the East Coast at this time. You had one up in Maine, and then you had the one here in North Carolina, and that's pretty much all that I've really found so far. I think there's a few other fishing co-ops, but it was a pretty new concept, and so you know, it might have it failed, but it was experimental. So you have to keep that in mind. So that brings us to a close with this series. Thanks a lot for tuning in and watching. I hope you learned something about the North Carolina Fisheries Incorporated and the status of the commercial fishing industry in North Carolina during the Great Depression. I think these are things that have been forgotten and haven't been talked about enough.